Pray with me. Lord, we're here today. We may be small in number, but we know the most important guest. You are here. And each of us has come with a different perspective this morning. And we are trusting you to let us have at least a glimpse into your perspective. Amen. If you were here last week, you'll remember that we talked about how God is always looking to deepen our faith, to help us see him more clearly and understand him better. And nowhere did that need to happen more than in Jesus' hometown of Nazareth. This was the first time Jesus had been home since he'd left Nazareth to go be baptized by John in the Jordan River. But many stories about him had worked their way back through the grapevine in the meantime. So when he went to the synagogue that first Sabbath, I'm sure the people were very eager to hear what he would have to say. Let me tell you, they didn't hear what they expected. Now, to really understand this bizarre story of an inauguration gone wrong, you really have to know a little of the history of Galilee and of the village of Nazareth itself. For these were very particular people with a very particular passion for a very particular mission. And that's why Jesus said what he did. And it's also why they tried to throw him over a cliff. Literally. Here's how Israel looked in Jesus' day. There was Judea to the south, Galilee to the north, and Samaria sandwiched in between. Remember from the story of Jesus and the woman at the well, the Samaritan woman. A lot of Jews didn't like to go through Samaria because they considered it unclean, so they would go all the way around if they had to go from Judea to Galilee. But it wasn't always like this. When the Israelites first went into the promised land, thousands of years before, all of this was the kingdom of Israel. But after King Solomon died, the kingdom of Israel split into two kingdoms. The southern kingdom was comprised only of the tribe of Judah, which you still see as Judea here. And the area shown here as Samaria and Galilee was the northern kingdom, which comprised the other 10 tribes. But then, because of their continued idolatry, the Israelites were carried into exile. The northern kingdom was conquered first by Assyria. And when the Assyrians took over, they captured most of the Jews and carried them off. Then they sent in a bunch of Assyrians, Gentiles, to live there and mingle and intermarry with the Jews who had been left behind. Now, sometime later, the southern kingdom of Judah was conquered by Babylon. And Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, he looted everything, but he only carted off the wealthiest and most elite Jews to Babylon, and he left the majority of the tribe of Judah behind. And Nebuchadnezzar also didn't send in any of his own people to live there. What was left of Judah simply became a province of Babylon. So, 70 years later, when the Israelites were sent back from exile, the ones who returned to Judah found fellow Jews with their spiritual and ethnic culture intact. But Samaria and Galilee had been infiltrated by foreigners, and they were full of Gentiles. So most of the returning Jews simply settled in Judea. Until about 150 years before Christ, when some enterprising Israelites decided to try to conquer Galilee. You see, in Isaiah chapter 9, which is one of the prophecies of the Messiah, it mentions that he will in some way be connected with Galilee. So they set out to occupy the land. They were going to make the way straight for their Messiah. And they had some success. Nazareth, in fact, was one of the villages that was founded during this campaign. And there were probably some others. But the crusade wasn't wholly successful, which meant that by the time Jesus arrived, the land of Galilee had become this sort of hybrid region. There were still plenty of Gentiles living amongst the Jews who had occupied the land, but there were also a few exclusively Jewish enclaves like Nazareth. So, You had the extra super holy territory of Judea, the extra super heathen territory of Samaria, and then at the top you had this danger zone of Galilee where the two coexisted, where you might be a holy and devout Jew, but you had to beware of all that Gentile heathenism around you. You can imagine that the exclusively Jewish villages in such a region would probably be highly strict and very sensitive about religious matters. And that's just what we find in this story. When Jesus read from Isaiah 61 on that day in the synagogue, the fact that he left out their favorite part of the chapter enraged them. In fact, out of the 11 verses in this chapter of Isaiah, Jesus quoted only 1.5. He left out the rest of the chapter. And it was these verses he omitted that had become the credo for those Jewish settlers in Gentile land. See, by that time, they had their own Aramaic version of Isaiah 61. And here's how a portion of it reads. You, that's the Jews, you shall eat the possessions of the Gentiles, and in their glory you shall be indulged. Instead of your being ashamed and confounded, I will bring you double the benefits I have promised, and the Gentiles who are boasting in their lot will be ashamed. This text was surely at the heart of the Nazarenes' history and self-understanding. Here in Isaiah, the anticipated golden age of the Messiah promised great things. And it promised great things in Galilee. With the coming of the anointed one of God, all the hard work would be done by foreigners, and they, the chosen people, would become wealthy, thanks to the labor of those heathens. Their goal was to make Galilee of the Gentiles into Galilee of the Jews, and live a life of luxury and opulence while their Gentile slaves waited on them hand and foot. So with this in mind, we can reconstruct the following. Jesus, the local boy, came to town as an itinerant rabbi and was given a chance to have his say. His audience of settlers understood the text of Isaiah 61 along the lines I have just indicated. Now, with everyone listening intently, Jesus stood up and chose to read this familiar and deeply beloved passage. But to their shock and amazement, he stopped reading at the very point at which judgment and servitude is pronounced upon the Gentiles, whom they, as a settler community, were there to displace. Then, he had the audacity to declare that the appointed day had arrived. He claimed to be this Messiah, which meant that this golden age was commencing. But if that was true, then it was commencing without the Gentile enslavement scenario they had envisioned. No wonder the people burst into frenzied chatter. Luke says they were amazed. Isn't this Joseph's son? They asked. Can't you just hear the incredulity behind that question? Didn't he grow up here? Doesn't he realize who we are? Why we're here? By this time, Jesus had definitely stirred the pot. And he'd thrown the people into a bit of a rough spot. For his messianic claim left them with only two alternatives. Either Jesus was indeed the anointed one of God and he should be followed, or he was an arrogant, presumptuous, and perhaps dangerous young man who must be silenced. While they were no doubt beginning to mull over these two options, Jesus went right on. Verse 23, he said to them, "Oh, surely you'll quote me this proverb, 'Physician, heal yourself.' And you will tell me, 'Do here in your hometown what we have heard you did in Capernaum.'" In other words, Jesus was saying, now that I've told you I'm the Messiah, the first thing you're going to say is, "Prove it." But I'm here to tell you, that no prophet has ever been accepted by his own people. Don't you remember Elijah? He was sent to a widow of great faith in Sidon, not Israel. And what about Elisha, that great prophet? While lepers in Israel were wasting away, he healed an army general from Syria. It was far too much for them to take. Jesus had not heeded the words of famous British author Oscar Wilde, who said, "If you want to tell people the truth, make them laugh. Otherwise, they'll kill you." Jesus certainly hadn't made them laugh, and they were enraged upon hearing the truth. In their fury, they rushed up, grabbed Jesus, and dragged him off toward the cliff. By invoking these stories of heroic Gentile faith, Jesus was saying, in fact, today, the golden age of the Messiah has begun. But if you want to be part of it, you must imitate the faith of these Gentiles. I'm not asking you merely to tolerate or to accept them. You must see such Gentiles as your spiritual superiors and acknowledge that they can instruct you in the nature of authentic faith. For the benefits of the kingdom I have come to establish are as much available to them as they are to you. Well, Jesus didn't get a chance to ask if they would accept his invitation or not. It was a definite no. We can only wonder if the way he miraculously escaped his intended execution might have inspired some of them to stop and reconsider his claim to be the Messiah. Either way, one of the stunning revelations about God in this story, I think, is that he always speaks truth. Even if it will be extremely unpopular, even if it will get him killed. He doesn't care how it will look. He doesn't care how it will sound. He doesn't care what it does to his image, because he's not thinking of himself. In fact, the reason he always speaks truth is because he's thinking of us. You see, over the centuries, the people of Nazareth had created an image of the kingdom of God in their minds that didn't quite line up with reality. Their idea of God and his attitude toward non-Jews was more like that image created with the forced perspective technique we saw in the video a few moments ago. They had a certain picture of God's kingdom and of their place in it, which to them appeared correct and all beautifully lined up. But on that day in the synagogue, Jesus took the camera, so to speak, and moved it. He turned it so they could see the truth, so they could see the reality that their ideas about God's kingdom were nothing more than a cleverly constructed illusion. The people of Nazareth were dangerously off course. They had forced their worldview into a certain perspective, and if they didn't change direction, they would end up being totally oblivious to the kingdom unfolding right before their eyes. And God didn't want any one of them to miss out on it. He would leave no stone unturned in his quest to open their eyes and set them free. That's exactly what he told them, isn't it? The Spirit of the Lord is on me, because he has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind. It's just that the people in the synagogue that day didn't realize that they were the ones who were blind, and they were the ones who needed to be freed. And isn't that usually the way it is? It's so much easier for us to look at others and see where they're off base. It's so much easier for us to solve other people's problems, while all the while we're oblivious to our own weaknesses and shortcomings. God isn't oblivious. And he won't ultimately leave us oblivious either. If we're blind, he'll tell us. If we're naked, he'll tell us. If we're headed down a path to destruction, he's probably going to do more than just tell us. He'll do whatever it takes to disrupt our forced perspective and help us to see reality. Do you remember what Jesus said would set people free? The truth. You will know the truth, he said, and the truth will set you free. There's nothing vague about that statement. That's the way it works. When God brings the truth to you, and he will, it makes you free. And the only way you can end up back in bondage is if you choose to go back to the chains. You will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. And that's why the God who so wants us to be free always speaks truth.